A very dangerous storm is about to strike Britain, but there's a twist buried inside this forecast that almost nobody saw coming, because the very thing meteorologists are warning people to prepare for is also the thing finally bringing relief from one of the most punishing heat waves the country has endured in decades. After weeks of record-breaking heat that pushed temperatures into territory rarely seen on British soil, the skies are now preparing to unleash violent thunderstorms, and the Met Office wants everyone across the country to understand that the danger is far from over, even as the heat itself finally begins to break. To understand why this storm carries such serious risk, you first need to understand just how extreme the heat leading up to it has actually been. The Met Office confirmed 3 consecutive days of record-breaking temperatures, with readings peaking provisionally at 37.3 degrees Celsius in Santon-Downham, Suffolk, a figure that smashed the long-standing June heat record dating all the way back to 1976 by more than a full degree. Forecasters describe that kind of margin as genuinely significant, since national temperature records in the UK are typically broken by only the slimmest of fractions, not by a clean, decisive degree. Wales set its own new daily maximum temperature record for June as well, with 35.9 degrees recorded at Butte Park in Cardiff, while overnight temperatures broke records too, with 23.5 degrees reported as the highest minimum temperature ever recorded overnight in the UK and in Wales specifically. The human cost of that heat has already been severe, and it forms an important backdrop for understanding why the coming storm matters so much. Health officials reported a surge in life-threatening emergency calls during the peak of the heat wave, forcing hundreds of schools and nurseries to close their doors entirely rather than risk exposing children to dangerous conditions. Tragically, at least 6 people drowned during the heat wave itself, adding to 15 separate water-related fatalities recorded back in May. A grim reminder that hot weather draws people toward rivers, lakes, and coastlines, even when conditions there remain genuinely hazardous. The RNLI's National Water Safety, my partner, has repeatedly stressed a point many people overlook during a heat wave, that even when air temperatures climb into the 30s, the water itself remains dangerously cold, capable of triggering cold water shock that can incapacitate even strong swimmers within seconds. Now here's the twist buried inside all of this. The very storms threatening to bring lightning, large hail, and gusty winds across central and eastern England are simultaneously the mechanism finally breaking this brutal heat wave apart. Met Office Chief Forecaster Dan Harris explained that while many parts of the UK were already noticing temperatures dropping, those in eastern England specifically were facing another uncomfortably warm and humid night, prolonging the risk of heat-related health impacts even as fresher air began arriving from the Atlantic elsewhere across the country. In other words, the same storm system that sounds purely dangerous on paper is actually the long-awaited pressure release valve for a heat wave that has already proven deadly, even though it introduces an entirely new and immediate set of risks in the process. That duality is exactly why forecasters are urging people not to relax, simply because the heat is finally retreating. A yellow weather warning has been issued covering the window when these storms are expected to be most active, with forecasters specifically flagging the potential for frequent lightning, large hail, gusty winds, and brief but intensely heavy downpours capable of causing sudden localized flooding. Unlike a gradual cool down, this transition is happening abruptly and violently, meaning people who spent the last several days focused entirely on heat, safety now need to pivot almost overnight toward an entirely different category of severe weather risk. If you're finding this breakdown useful, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because the real-world disruption these storms have already caused reveals just how seriously this system needs to be taken. The disruption began almost immediately once the storm started forming. Flight tracking data showed a total of 484 inbound and outbound flights, delayed across Gatwick and Heathrow airports by the evening the storms first developed, with Heathrow seeing 42% of its flights delayed and Gatwick seeing a full 50% of its schedule pushed back. For an aviation hub as busy as London's airport system, disruption at that scale ripples outward across the entire country and beyond, affecting travelers who have nothing directly to do with the UK, but simply happen to be connecting through British airspace at the wrong moment. Beyond aviation, meteorologists are warning that the same intense humidity that made the preceding heat wave so oppressive is now supercharging these thunderstorms, loading the atmosphere with the moisture needed to produce genuinely severe convective weather rather than the milder, shorter-lived showers Britain typically experiences. Storm forecasters tracking the broader pattern have noted that colder air moving in aloft, associated with an upper-level trough pushing across the northern UK, is steepening what meteorologists call lapse rates, essentially the rate at which temperature drops with altitude, a key ingredient that supports the development of more vigorous, longer-lasting thunderstorms rather than the brief, disorganized showers that tend to fizzle out quickly on their own. Certain regions face an elevated risk of localized flooding specifically because of how these storms are expected to move, or in some cases, fail to move at all. Weak steering winds over parts of Northern Ireland mean any thunderstorms that develop there could become slow-moving, sitting over the same location for an extended period rather than passing through quickly. When a thunderstorm stalls in place like that, even moderate rainfall rates can add up to genuinely dangerous total accumulations. Within just an hour or two, overwhelming drainage systems that are designed to handle typical British rainfall rather than sudden, concentrated downpours. Emergency planners have specifically flagged this stalling risk as one of the more dangerous aspects of the current pattern, since it can catch people off guard even in areas that might otherwise look relatively calm on a broader regional radar map. This storm event is also unfolding against the backdrop of a summer that has already reshaped what officials consider a genuinely extreme weather event in the UK. Since red weather warnings for extreme heat were first introduced back in 2021, they have rarely been issued at all, yet this particular heat wave triggered red warnings on 3 consecutive days, marking the first time that specific milestone had ever been recorded nationally. Wales saw its very first red extreme heat warning during this same stretch, an unprecedented development for a country not historically associated with this level of heat risk. Scientists studying the broader pattern have been direct about the connection to climate change, stating plainly that a heat wave of this particular intensity and duration would have been virtually impossible 50 years ago, and that human-driven warming, largely caused by burning fossil fuels, is making events like this measurably more frequent and more severe with each passing year. The heat dome responsible for this entire sequence of events did not confine its effects to Britain alone either. Meteorologists have traced the same area of high pressure responsible for trapping heat over the UK back to a broader pattern settling across Western Europe more generally, meaning much of the continent has been enduring comparable extremes simultaneously, rather than Britain facing this heat in isolation. That broader continental warmth matters, because it means the atmosphere feeding into these UK storms has been drawing on an unusually warm, moisture-rich reservoir of air stretching across a huge portion of Europe, rather than the more typical, comparatively drier conditions that usually accompany a British summer storm breaking a heat wave. Even the ocean itself has not escaped the consequences of this prolonged heat. Marine heat waves, a term describing unusually warm conditions persisting in ocean water over an extended period, have developed across the southern North Sea and parts of the English Channel as a direct result of how long this heat event has lasted. Scientists warn that marine heat waves of this kind can carry genuinely negative consequences for marine ecosystems, disrupting the delicate balance of species that depend on cooler, more stable water temperatures, effects that may not become fully apparent for months or even years after the immediate heat wave itself has faded from public attention. For people across the UK trying to navigate the next few days safely, the practical guidance from officials is refreshingly direct even amid all this complexity. Avoid shelter in. Gee under isolated trees during active thunderstorms, since they represent one of the most common locations for lightning strikes to cause injury or death. Stay away from flood-prone underpasses and low-lying roads if heavy rainfall begins falling rapidly in your area, since it takes a surprisingly small amount of fast-moving water to sweep a vehicle off the road entirely. And perhaps most importantly, do not assume that cooler temperatures automatically mean reduced danger, since this particular storm system is proving that the transition away from extreme heat can introduce its own entirely separate category of serious risk almost overnight. Infrastructure across the country has already begun bearing the strain of this rapid transition from extreme heat straight into severe convective storms. Rail operators, already dealing with speed restrictions imposed during the hottest days to prevent tracks from buckling under the heat, now face an entirely different challenge as lightning strikes and sudden flooding threaten signal equipment and low-lying sections of track. Utility companies have likewise had to shift their focus almost overnight, moving from managing surging air conditioning demand during the heat wave itself toward preparing for the kind of localized power outages that intense lightning and gusty winds commonly cause when they strike substations or bring down overhead lines. This kind of rapid pivot between two completely different categories of weather emergency places unusual strain on emergency response teams, who typically have more time to transition their focus gradually rather than within a matter of hours. Coastal communities face their own particular version of this same challenge. Having just endured a heat wave that drew unusually large crowds toward beaches, rivers, and coastal waters, despite repeated safety warnings about dangerously cold water temperatures, many of these same areas must now brace foe. Are sudden thunderstorms capable of producing dangerous rip currents, abrupt wind shifts, and lightning risk for anyone still lingering near open water as the storms move through? Coast Guard and lifeboat services have specifically urged people to check local forecasts before heading toward the coast in the coming days, since a beach that looked perfectly calm and inviting during the peak heat wave could very quickly become genuinely hazardous once these storms arrive. Agricultural regions across the country are watching this transition closely as well, since the shift from prolonged dry heat towards sudden, intense rainfall creates its own distinct set of challenges. Soil baked hard by weeks of extreme heat tends to absorb sudden heavy rainfall poorly, meaning much of the water from these storms is likely to run off rapidly rather than soaking in to meaningfully replenish groundwater or ease drought stress building across parts of the country. Farmers who might otherwise welcome rain after such an intense dry spell instead face the added risk of flash flooding damaging crops or eroding topsoil, illustrating once again how this particular weather transition manages to introduce new complications almost as quickly as it resolves the old ones. Emergency planners have also been keen to stress that this pattern of severe heat giving way to violent storms is becoming a more familiar feature of recent UK summers rather than a rare standalone occurrence. Comparing this event to similar heat to storm transitions in recent years, meteorologists note that warmer background temperatures overall mean the atmosphere can hold significantly more moisture than it once could, effectively loading each subsequent storm system with more energy and more available rainfall than equivalent events would have carried several decades ago. That broader trend is part of why forecasters are treating this particular storm with such seriousness, since it represents not just an isolated weather event, but another data point in a pattern that appears to be intensifying gradually year after year. The same atmospheric setup capable of producing life-threatening extreme heat is now producing the very storms needed to finally break that heat apart. Storms which themselves carry serious, independent risks of their own. If this breakdown of Britain's dangerous storm and its unexpected twist helped make sense of what is actually happening in the skies overhead, make sure you are subscribed, because with a summer already this volatile, there is no telling what strange turn the forecast takes next.